Chuck was born in Montreal in 1931, and he comes from a family that was both Anglophone and Francophone. He graduated with first-class honours in history from McGill in 1952 and was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, where he graduated in PPE in 1955. From 1955 to 1961, he was a Fellow of All Souls College, where he worked on his doctorate supervised by Isaiah Berlin. In 1961, he returned to teach at McGill, and he spent the 1960s as well as teaching and publishing. He published The Explanation of Behaviour, based on his doctorate in 1964, fighting elections for the New Democratic Party and bringing up a family of 5 daughters. I'll mention only some of his writings, some that seem to me among the most significant of a very, very significant group. In 1971, an article that has remained seminal, Interpretation and the Sciences of Man. In 1975, a large and still massively important book on Hegel. It's, if I may interject, perhaps difficult for us to appreciate now, quite what what an act of unusual bravery it was to publish a large book on Hegel in those days. And if the climate has changed, which I think it definitely has, then not least thanks to Chuck. From 1976 to 1981, he was Chichely Professor of Social and Political Theory in Oxford, which is where I had the benefit of his teaching. And then he returned to Canada and McGill, though he's held visiting appointments in many other institutions. And in 1989, he published the first of his great books of what we call in German Geschichtsphilosophie, philosophical history, The Sources of the Self. In 1992, a long article, long contribution, which was, again, seminal, The Politics of Recognition, which I'm sure most of you know, more or less initiated debates on multiculturalism and its relation to liberalism. In 2007, a book which perhaps will be the capstone of a long and distinguished career, A Secular Age. What was very distinctive about you as a member of the community of English-speaking philosophers is that you were someone who had a much more sympathetic view of traditions outside analytical philosophy than was common at that time. So I guess I want to ask you how far that goes back and whether you can say anything about the young Charles Taylor which led him to that straddle analytical and continental French and English culture.
Well, I mean, that goes back to the very beginning, because the family was bilingual from the beginning, and there were, relations on both sides and connections on both sides. So the idea of just thinking it out in English wasn't on the cards from the very beginning. But I think more specifically, it was actually going to Oxford, because I did history in the first degree at McGill. There I did philosophy, and at that time, a kind of very low-level positivism was, the rage in philosophy in Oxford. And I kept saying, is this really philosophy? It seemed to me to be very thin, not to address any interesting questions. And then somebody came along and said, you should read this book. And they handed me Merleau-Ponty, Phénoménologie de la Perception. And I thought, wow, this was... So I got off onto the phenomenological tradition, not via Husserl, not via Heidegger, but via Merleau-Ponty. And then from there, one goes, in all directions, back to Hegel. I mean, Merleau-Ponty at one point said, everything in today's philosophy originates in Hegel. And I thought, well, that doesn't include the people I've been listening to in Oxford. But he was...
I knew that you were involved in what then became the New Left Review, Would you like to talk to us a little bit about it, and perhaps remembering that not everyone is an older generation or knows about the UK? How did that happen, and what was it?
Well, that was the response to quite a crisis in Europe, crisis in the world. 1956, on one hand, you had the invasion of Suez by the French and British, right, and they're having to draw back because of Eisenhower. At the same time, the same year, you had the Hungarian uprising and the crushing of it, right? So there was a massive movement of a lot of younger people, on one hand, to be somewhat disenchanted with Western social democracy for a variety of reasons, but on the other hand, the people who had been admirers of the Soviet system, people who had been members of the Communist Party, also came out in droves, right? So there was a great attempt, let's rethink the whole of the left, the whole of the socialist enterprise, and in a certain sense, we, for postgraduates at Oxford, set up something which turned out to channel a lot of that in the UK. And that was the Universities in the Left Review, it was called, later New Left. Of course, it's been used since, at different moments, different things are new, right? So it's been used since, but that was a launching pad for a lot of very interesting thought and action and organization.
So you've been, if I may say so, a social democrat, man and boy.
More or less. No, I was a teenage liberal. Yeah.
So one name that came to me, to whom you haven't mentioned, but who's often thought of, well, I would think of him when I was an undergraduate and reading, people were critical of various kind of standard accounts of social science, was Alistair MacIntyre. Was he someone with whom you had interaction?
Oh, yes, very much so. I mean, he wasn't there at the same time as me, but we were very close. It was the founding of the New Left Review and New Left meetings that we had in the latter half of the 50s. We were both very involved with that. And so I got to know Alistair very, very early on. And I must say, he's been an inspiration to me the whole length of my career. He's always coming out with a new book, which is something very interesting. And
I just want to take you back to your Oxford days, and in many ways, one way of understanding your work, you were supervised by Isaiah Berlin, who was one of the great kind of defenders of liberalism in the 20th century. And you also worked very closely, as I understand it, with Elizabeth Anscombe, who in many ways is one of the founders, if not the founder, of modern virtue ethics and a kind of recovery of Aristotelian philosophy. Can you say a little bit about how, in a sense, you've wrestled with and stood on the cusp between, in a sense, the influence of those two schools of thought in your own work, and kind of unpack for a bit how you understand the legacy of those two figures?
Yeah. Well, they kind of were complementary for me. Let's take Elizabeth first. I mean, that Oxford was dominated by a very narrow form of analytic philosophy, and particularly in ethics. It was very, very narrow. And it got to the point where people had no more memory even of virtue ethics. And it was Elizabeth, of course, and her husband, Peter Geach. They both worked very closely together. And so it erupted. I mean, things that if you were more in the Thomistic tradition would have been, commonplaces were thrown in as other very radical ideas, upsetting everything around. And I really, appreciated that very much. And as a matter of fact, my first book on the explanation of behavior, about the issue really of teleological explanation, that also connected up with issues that arose. She had one of these wonderful Oxford seminars, right, where incredible things happened. Now, on the other side, there's another side to my work which Isaiah Berlin very much spoke to, which is the historical side. I mean, in a certain sense, the kind of thinking that Elizabeth had was a little bit like her opponents, rather ahistorical. I mean, what's the right moral view, right? So specie aeterni, and they argued about that. But Isaiah Berlin really had a very broad sense of the history of thinking, of political thinking in Europe, added to his Russian background. The person he most loved was Herzen, and so it was, and deeply steeped in the German tradition, Vico as well. So that was something that's been very important for me.
I've noticed that you have simultaneously emphasized the central importance of interreligious encounters and dialogue, as you just did right now in your comments. And yet, at the same time, you've been very clear to say that doesn't mean a syncretism. That doesn't mean a lack of distinctiveness among the religions in what each one is bringing into the world. Could you explain that a little bit, how those two things fit together for you and how we should think about that relationship?
Yeah. I mean, if you think of religion simply as a set of propositions, then obviously the ones of Buddhism and the ones of Christianity, they don't mesh, right? But if you think of a faith as a path or an ensemble of possible paths of spiritual development, then you can't just have something which is a kind of mix. I mean, the Dalai Lama said it wonderfully at a meeting I was at once. He said, you can't put a sheep's head on a yak's body. If you're a Christian, how are you trying to go further along in this faith? By kind of prayer, in my case, kind of meditation, which is like prayer, in which you're trying to reach that extraordinary love of God through Christ and the way it can transform you and pass on. It's not the same kind of thing as if you're a Buddhist, or the same kind of thing as, you go on to all these others. It isn't just a potpourri. It's just, you can't put all these things together as a path. But you can find in people on the other paths, Muslim, Buddhist, and so on, people who are really striving in sort of the same direction, with even great overlap in how they want to realize things in the world.